Hi folks, this video walks through the sample real estate lease on the NYC CNC website. I am not an attorney, and this video is not in any way a substitute for seeking proper legal counsel, as you should if you're entering into any sort of real estate lease or contract. Nevertheless, I wanted to cover some highlight points to at least help you have a better conversation with your own attorney, or if you're negotiating a lease, be aware of what some of these terms mean. This lease starts with an Article 1 basic terms. And I think this is a great point to emphasize that anything that you want to be included in your lease needs to be in the lease. Do not rely on any verbal conversation, any in-person conversation, any emails, it's text messages, etc. If you want it in the lease, it needs to be written in the lease. Many of the terms are self-explanatory, but some of these things can be great reminders to think about. For example, if you are leasing a space at a building that has multiple tenants, if you are able to or want to have any specific number of parking spaces allocated to you, and expect that base rent will generally increase each year, even if it's on a pre-structured rate increase. That's something that landlords often want and do receive versus a flat rent throughout. You should also be aware of the difference between a triple net lease and a gross lease. A triple net lease generally means the tenant is responsible for its share of things like the utilities, property taxes, maintenance, perhaps even a management fee, building insurance, etc., meaning that you may owe not only the base rent, but quite a bit more in the form of those triple net reimbursements. A full service lease generally means those items are already included in that full service or that gross rental rate, and so you generally shouldn't see any additional expenses. Article 2 speaks to the lease term, so usually that's how long your lease is, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but it also speaks to Section 2.02, which is whether you as the tenant have any option to extend it, and if so, possibly at a pre-negotiated rent. You may see an option that's granted, but it would be at a market rent, and so you and the landlord have to go through a process to decide what that market rent would be. Section 2.03, holding over, gives the landlord the right to charge you a predetermined higher rent if you remain past your lease term, basically an incentive for you to stay within a lease and renew or not stay past the term of your lease. Section 4.01 details out what other additional expenses the tenant would be responsible for. This is very important in any lease, especially in a triple net lease. And in general, leases, even if they are long, this one is 9 pages long, I've seen them longer than 50 pages, are a document that both you and your lawyer really need to read all the way through. You may also consider sending it to your accountant if you have questions about the accounting or financial implications of a lease. 4.02, you generally are going to be required to have insurance. So if you are moving from a home-based business, there's a chance you don't have business insurance. Luckily, it's not a big deal, nor is it generally expensive, but it is something you want to be aware of and get ahead of. I've seen other folks find a space, get a lease ready, and are unable to sign that lease because the landlord will absolutely demand evidence of insurance. 5.01, permitted uses. This section ties back to 1.06 above, which speaks to, in this case, the property shall be used for machine shop operations, fabrication, training, and general office. Make sure these permitted uses match your actual use. The remaining items in Section 5, hazardous materials, signage, indemnity, landlord access, and quiet possession. Again, getting into the weeds here, it's worth noting, though, that if you want to put up a sign, that may be something that your lease needs to speak to ahead of time. Hazardous materials. Be aware of what is a hazardous material and how your landlord's going to deal with it if you have any on site, including something that may be as innocuous as a can of paint. Landlord's access and quiet possession. What these basically mean is that the landlord, under certain circumstances or with certain notice, does have the right to enter into your property. Quiet possession, though, also means, as a general rule, they're going to leave you alone. If the tenant pays the rent and complies, you can use the property and enjoy the property without being bothered or hassled by the landlord. Section 6 here speaks to all the conditions of the property, repairs and alterations. This is incredibly important because it both protects the landlord, but it also protects the tenant. What rights do you have to make improvements? Are those improvements something that you can take with you later, or do they stay with the building? Where do you need notice if you're going to make improvements? And finally, what condition must the space be in when you are done with your lease? Section 7, I encourage you not to skip over this, damage or destruction. A great example to summarize this would be what happens if another part of the building has a fire and somebody like the local fire department or town says that you can no longer be in this building or you cannot be in this building for a certain number of days. How does your lease handle that? Are you still obligated to pay the rent? Are you going to have to get an attorney involved? Read through this and again, speak with your attorney to make sure it's appropriate for your building and your situation. Article 9, assignment and subletting. Some leases will allow you to sublease the space. This can be really helpful if you want to abandon the lease or you want to leave the premises. Instead of abandoning your lease, you may attempt to sublet it. And if you sublease it, you may be able to actually make more money. If you sublease it for a higher rate than your lease, you may owe that money to the landlord, or you may not be permitted to. Nevertheless, I think it's important in a real estate lease to understand what your options are, both in a good case scenario where you outgrow the space and in a bad case scenario where you need to abandon the lease or abandon the space. It's also worth having a conversation with your attorney about understanding how your state or how your country handles tenants' obligations. Some states in the United States are very tenant friendly, some are very landlord friendly. Meaning, in some states, if a tenant abandons a lease, meaning they stop paying the rent, but they also stop using the space, a landlord has things like commercially reasonable efforts to attempt to release the space, meaning the landlord isn't able to just sit there and collect rent checks from you or pursue you for that amount without trying to use commercially reasonable efforts to release the space. Again, I am not an attorney. This is something you should speak to your attorney about, but it also ties in the business element of understanding, hey, in a very real world situation, let's say you, the business owner, are hurt or injured in a vehicle accident and you can no longer use your machine shop or your building and you need to get rid of this lease. What are your options? What are the landlord's options? Defaults and remedies is a section that basically deals with what is considered a default, which means whether you or the landlord fail to meet one of your lease obligations. A classic example would be you don't pay the rent. In that case, the tenant would be in the default. A landlord can also be in default as well. For example, if something happens to the building and the landlord fails to meet its obligations to repair that problem. Defaults are then able to be cured, which means fixed, and the lease will speak to how much time and under what notice you must handle those events. So in other words, if something happens that requires a default to be cured, you, the tenant, may need to be notified. In other words, if your rent check got lost in the mail, the landlord may need to let you know, hey, we didn't receive your rent this month. Section 11 would be stuff to speak to your attorney about, dealing usually with how the landlord would work with lenders on subordination and attornment agreements. An estoppel certificate is something that usually a lender will want to see if they're going to mortgage that building, that basically says you as a tenant are happy in the space, you're using the space, you're there, you're a real tenant, and the bank who's making a loan on this building can expect that you'll continue to pay the rent. Section 13 deals with important legal topics, again, things you should speak to your attorney about, but who is notified when certain events happen. Force majeure, which speaks to whether there's an act of God that can supersede the lease. Severability, which means if one part of the lease actually isn't legal, it doesn't invalidate the rest, and so forth. And finally, the signatures. The last point I'll emphasize is if you're looking to do a lease, I absolutely encourage you to enlist the help of a real estate professional or real estate broker. They're going to be familiar with market rates, with other opportunities or buildings. You should negotiate with the landlord and do your best to drive a competitive market rate deal. In certain circumstances, there are very market-specific dynamics that are really important. In other words, in your area or town or city, is it common to have a 1-year lease or a 3-year lease or a 5-year lease? Perhaps you want to do a shorter lease with the option to renew. Perhaps you'd like to work in something about a right of first refusal or a right of first option to purchase the building or the space if it becomes available. And again, depending on the market as well as your credit worthiness as a tenant, many landlords are willing to extend some form of a tenant improvement allowance, which basically means you get money to improve the space. Now, the landlord will usually coordinate this, and it's improvements that they need to approve of, meaning they're willing to make improvements that will generally improve the space even if you are no longer the tenant in the future. So they may do things like improve the floors or the lightings or painting. They're not necessarily going to want to install something that's very specific to your use as a tenant.